The photo appeared tranquil, depicting two friends, but observe closely the man's hand on her shoulder. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Charleston Historical Society's Restoration Lab, casting golden squares across the worn wooden floor. Dr. Emma Richardson adjusted her magnifying lamp and pulled another photograph from the estate donation box, this one mounted in an ornate gilt frame. She carefully removed the protective tissue paper. A studio portrait from the 1850s. The photograph showed a well-dressed white man and a black woman posed formally before a painted backdrop of a pastoral scene. They stood close together, the man's hand resting on the woman's shoulder. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard daguerreotype of the era, wealthy subjects captured for posterity. The man wore an expensive dark suit with a silk waistcoat, his hair pomaded and neat. The woman beside him was striking, dressed in a gown of fine taffeta with elaborate lace trim, her hair styled in the fashionable ringlets of the period. The dress alone would have cost a fortune, the kind of garment only the wealthy could afford. Yet something about the image disturbed Emma's trained eye. She had examined thousands of 19th century photographs, and this one felt wrong in ways she couldn't immediately articulate. She positioned the daguerreotype under the high-resolution scanner, a tool that had revealed countless hidden details in historical images over her 15-year career. The machine hummed softly as it captured every microscopic detail of the silver-coated copper plate. Emma pulled up the digital file on her screen and began zooming in, section by section. The man's face showed the slight blur of movement common in long exposures. The painted backdrop revealed brushstrokes invisible to the naked eye. And then she reached the woman's face. Her expression stopped Emma cold. The woman's eyes stared directly at the camera with an intensity that transcended the decades. Her mouth was set in a rigid line. Not quite a smile, not quite neutral. But it was the tension visible in her jaw, the tightness around her eyes that spoke of something deeper than the discomfort of holding still for a long exposure. Emma zoomed in on the man's hand resting on the woman's shoulder. His fingers were pressed firmly into the fabric of her dress, the pressure visible in the way the expensive taffeta bunched slightly beneath his grip. This wasn't the gentle, possessive touch of a husband. This was restraint. She leaned closer to the screen, her heart rate quickening. The woman's shoulder appeared slightly elevated on that side, as if she were trying to pull away from the touch, but couldn't. The musculature of her neck showed strain, barely perceptible, but unmistakable once noticed. Emma sat back in her chair, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. She flipped over the frame. Written in faded ink on a yellowed label. Mr. Jonathan Hartwell and his wife, Charleston, 1857. His wife. Emma's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the Historical Society's extensive database of Charleston families. The Hartwells were well documented, one of the old plantation families with roots stretching back to the colonial era. Jonathan Hartwell, born 1825, inherited Riverside Plantation from his father in 1850. The property records showed over 300 acres of rice fields and a recorded enslaved population of 47 people in the 1850 census. She found his marriage record quickly. Jonathan Hartwell married to Catherine, no surname given, in a private ceremony, June 1856. No surname, no family listed, no church records of banns being posted, which was standard practice for white marriages in Charleston society. Emma pulled up newspaper archives from the Charleston Mercury and the Charleston Courier. She found several mentions of Jonathan Hartwell in the society pages, attendance at balls, membership in the Agricultural Association, purchases of new equipment for his plantation, but not a single mention of his marriage, which should have been a major social event for a family of the Hartwells' standing. The silence was deafening. She opened a new search, looking for manumission records, legal documents proving that enslaved people had been freed. In the 1850s, South Carolina law required that any white man who married a black woman must first legally free her and obtain special permission from the legislature. The process was difficult, expensive, and socially ruinous, but it was possible. No manumission record for anyone named Catherine connected to Jonathan Hartwell. No legislative petition for permission to marry across racial lines. No legal documentation that would make this marriage legitimate under South Carolina law. Emma felt her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She called Dr. Marcus Webb, the Historical Society's senior researcher and an expert on antebellum Charleston. "Marcus, I need you to look at something. Now." He arrived 20 minutes later, his reading glasses already perched on his nose. Emma had the photograph displayed on her large monitor, zoomed in on the woman's face and the man's hand on her shoulder. Marcus studied the image in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "This isn't a marriage portrait. This is ownership documented." He pulled up a chair and began typing, accessing databases Emma didn't even know existed. In the 1850s, some plantation owners engaged in what they called informal marriages with enslaved women. The women had no legal rights, no ability to refuse, no protection under law, but the men would dress them in expensive clothes, give them better quarters, and present them publicly as wives to justify the relationship. "Justify rape," Emma said quietly. Marcus nodded grimly. The women were still enslaved, still property. The fancy dresses and studio portraits didn't change that fundamental fact. And if the man tired of them, or if they tried to leave, They could be sold away from any children they'd had, beaten or killed with no legal consequences. He zoomed in on the photograph even further, focusing on details Emma hadn't noticed. Around the woman's neck was a delicate gold chain, but at the base of her throat, barely visible beneath the high collar of her dress, was a thin line of scarring. "Collar marks," Marcus said. "From an iron collar, worn long enough to leave permanent scars." Emma spent the next week searching for any trace of Catherine in the historical record. Enslaved people left few documents behind. They weren't allowed to read or write in most southern states. Their births and deaths often went unrecorded, and their voices were systematically silenced. But Emma had learned over her career that traces remained if you knew where to look. She found the first clue in the plantation records of Riverside, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archive. The inventory of enslaved people from 1855 listed Catherine, female, age approximately 22, house servant, purchased from estate sale of Colonel Richard Thornton, September 1855. Purchased 6 months before the marriage. Emma traced back to the Thornton estate sale records. Colonel Richard Thornton had died suddenly in August 1855, and his entire estate, including 23 enslaved people, had been sold at auction to settle debts. The auction advertisement in the Charleston Mercury listed Catherine specifically. Healthy female, age 22, trained in fine needlework and household management, excellent cook, literate despite prohibition, no physical defects. Literate. Catherine could read and write, which was illegal for enslaved people in South Carolina and incredibly dangerous. Someone had taught her, probably in secret, at great risk. Emma's next discovery came from an unexpected source, a diary kept by Mary Simmons, a Charleston woman who wrote extensively about her social observations. The diary had been donated to the Historical Society in the 1960s and partially transcribed. Entry from November 1856. Attended tea at Mrs. Patterson's house. Much gossip about Jonathan Hartwell's peculiar arrangement. He has taken one of his servants as a wife and parades her about in silks and jewels as if she were a white woman. The creature is quite beautiful, I must admit, but the presumption is outrageous. Several ladies have ceased acknowledging him in public. His mother is said to be mortified. Entry from March 1857. Saw Jonathan Hartwell and his wife at the market. She walked 2 steps behind him, her eyes downcast, wearing a dress that must have cost $200. When Mrs. Henderson deliberately bumped into her, she apologized profusely, though the fault was clearly not hers. One could see the fear in her eyes. How terrible to be trapped in such a gilded cage. Emma found more entries over the following months. Mary Simmons, unlike most of her contemporaries, seemed to recognize Catherine's humanity and her predicament. Entry from July 1857. I managed to speak briefly with the woman called Catherine at the dressmaker's shop. Mr. Hartwell had left her there while he conducted business. She has the most eloquent eyes I have ever seen. When I asked if she was well treated, she said nothing, but her hands trembled as she clutched her reticule. I noticed bruises on her wrists, barely concealed by her gloves. Marcus helped Emma piece together more of Catherine's background. Using the reference to Colonel Thornton, they discovered that Catherine had been born on a small farm in the South Carolina upcountry around 1833. Emma tracked down the Thornton family papers, housed at the University of South Carolina's special collections. Among the correspondence was a letter from Colonel Thornton to his sister, dated 1848. My dear sister, you asked about the education of the servants' children. I confess I have allowed my late wife's peculiar sentiments to influence me too much. She insisted that young Catherine be taught to read using the Bible, claiming it would make her a better Christian. Now the girl is 15 and far too clever for her own good. She reads everything she can find and asks questions that make the other servants restless. I fear I have created a problem I do not know how to solve. Catherine had been taught to read by Colonel Thornton's wife, a woman whose peculiar sentiments apparently included the radical notion that enslaved people had souls worth educating. When Mrs. Thornton died in 1852, Catherine had lost her only protector. Emma found more letters, these from Colonel Thornton's business correspondence. In 1854, he had written to a slave trader in Charleston, I have a house servant, female, age 21, who has become troublesome. She is literate and has been teaching other slaves to read against my explicit orders. She must be sold, but discreetly. She would fetch a good price for her skills and appearance, but her education makes her dangerous. Before the sale could be arranged, Colonel Thornton had died, and Catherine had ended up on the auction block, where Jonathan Hartwell saw her and decided he wanted her. The daguerreotype took on new horror as Emma understood its context. This wasn't a wedding portrait. It was a slave owner documenting his acquisition, dressing his property in expensive clothes to display his wealth and power. She found the photographer's records at the Charleston Museum. The portrait had been taken at Bradford's photography studio in April 1857. The studio ledger listed the sitting, Mr. J. Hartwell, daguerreotype, full plate, with female servant in formal dress. Special instructions. Subject must appear as married couple. Payment, $15. Female servant, not wife. The photographer had known exactly what this portrait represented. Emma discovered that Bradford's studio specialized in what they privately called peculiar portraits. Photographs of white men with their enslaved mistresses, dressed and posed to resemble legitimate marriages. It was a service provided discreetly for clients willing to pay premium prices. Marcus found testimony from a formerly enslaved man named Samuel who had lived on Riverside Plantation. His narrative had been collected by abolitionists in 1865, after the Civil War. Samuel's account was devastating. Mr. Hartwell bought Catherine from the auction and brought her to Riverside. He dressed her up like a fine lady and told everyone she was his wife, but we all knew the truth. At night, we could hear her crying in the big house. She tried to run away twice. The first time, Mr. Hartwell sent the patrollers after her. They brought her back, and he whipped her himself, then locked her in the attic for a week. The second time, he told her if she ever tried again, he would sell her children south. She didn't have children yet, but the threat was clear about what would happen if she did. Emma contacted Dr. Jennifer Marshall, a historian at Howard University who specialized in the experiences of enslaved women in the antebellum South. They met via video call, and Emma shared everything she had discovered. Dr. Marshall listened intently, her face growing more serious as Emma walked through the evidence. The photograph, the plantation records, Mary Simmons's diary entries, Samuel's testimony. This is textbook sexual slavery disguised as marriage, Dr. Marshall said when Emma finished. White slave owners often claimed their relationships with enslaved women were consensual, even romantic. They pointed to the expensive gifts, the better living conditions, the children they acknowledged. But consent is impossible in a relationship, where one person literally owns the other. She pulled up her own research files. I've documented over 200 similar cases from across the South. The pattern is consistent. The man purchases or inherits an enslaved woman, usually young and educated enough to serve as a companion as well as a sexual partner. He dresses her in fine clothes, gives her privileges above other enslaved people, and sometimes even stages mock marriage ceremonies. But legally, she remains his property. She cannot refuse his advances, cannot leave, cannot protect any children born from the relationship. What happened to these women after the Civil War? Emma asked. It varied. Some were freed when their husbands died or when the Union Army arrived. Others were sold or abandoned when the men lost interest or faced social pressure. Many died in slavery, leaving no records behind. The ones who survived often refused to speak about their experiences, the trauma too deep to revisit. Dr. Marshall zoomed in on the photograph of Catherine. Look at her hands. Notice how she's holding them? That's a defensive posture, fingers interlaced tightly, pressing against her abdomen. In portrait analysis, we call that a comfort gesture. The subject is under significant stress. Emma hadn't noticed before, but Dr. Marshall was right. Catherine's hands were clutched together so tightly that the knuckles appeared pale even in the old daguerreotype. The expensive dress is a cage, Dr. Marshall continued. It marks her as her owner's property more clearly than chains would. Every person who saw her in those clothes knew exactly what she was. A slave playing dress-up at her master's command. The humiliation was part of the control. Emma felt sick. She had spent her career restoring and preserving historical photographs, but she had never fully grasped how photographs could be weapons. Tools of oppression documenting violations under the guise of respectability. What happened to Catherine? Dr. Marshall asked. Have you found any records after 1857? That was Emma's next task. She returned to the archives with renewed urgency, searching through death records, slave inventories, and estate documents. She found it in the Riverside Plantation records from 1859. Catherine, house servant, died in childbirth February 15th. Infant, also deceased. Total loss, $200. 26 years old, reduced to a dollar value in a ledger. Emma couldn't let Catherine's story end there. She began researching Jonathan Hartwell's life after 1859, hoping to find something, justice, consequence, anything, to suggest that Catherine's suffering had mattered. What she found instead was a pattern. In the 1860 census, just 1 year after Catherine's death, Hartwell's slave inventory listed a new house servant. Amelia, female, age 19. Emma's stomach turned. She dug deeper into the plantation records, finding purchase receipts. Jonathan Hartwell had bought Amelia in March 1859, 1 month after Catherine died. She found another daguerreotype in the estate collection, dated 1861. The same photographer, the same studio, the same composition. Jonathan Hartwell stood beside a young black woman in an expensive gown, his hand on her shoulder. Amelia. The woman's expression was different from Catherine's, more resigned, more hollow. Her eyes stared past the camera as if looking at something far away. The gold chain around her neck glinted in the photographer's lights, and Emma could just barely make out the same telltale scarring at the base of her throat. Marcus helped Emma trace Amelia's fate. She appeared in the plantation records until 1863, then vanished. No death record, no sale record, just an absence. Probably sold, Marcus said quietly. By 1863, the war was turning against the Confederacy. Plantations were being raided, enslaved people were escaping to Union lines. Hartwell might have sold her south before she could flee, or she might have successfully escaped and taken a different name. Emma found 3 more photographs over the following days, all from different estate collections in Charleston, all showing the same disturbing pattern. 5 different women over 15 years, all purchased by Jonathan Hartwell, all dressed in expensive clothes and posed as wives, all disappearing from the historical record after a few years. One of the later photographs from 1869 showed a woman named Sarah. This one was different, taken after the Civil War, after emancipation. But South Carolina during Reconstruction was a dangerous place for black women, especially those who had been forced into relationships with white men during slavery. Emma found an interview with Sarah, conducted by Freedmen's Bureau officials in 1871. The testimony was brief, but shattering. Question: You were formerly held in bondage by Mr. Jonathan Hartwell? Answer: Yes, sir. Question: And you lived in his house as his servant? Answer: He called me his wife, made me dress in fine clothes and pose for photographs, but I was never his wife. I was his slave. Question: You are now free. Why do you remain in Charleston? Answer: I have nowhere else to go. He gave me money when I left, said it was because he cared for me. But it was guilt money. You cannot pay for what was taken from me. Emma knew she had uncovered something significant, not just Catherine's story, but a broader pattern of abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for over 160 years. The photographs that had been preserved as marriage portraits were actually evidence of systematic sexual exploitation. She contacted the descendants of the Hartwell family, who still lived in Charleston. The current generation had donated the photographs to the Historical Society years ago, unaware of their true context. Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison, Jonathan Hartwell's great-great-great-granddaughter, agreed to meet Emma at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. She was a lawyer in her 50s, with the careful manner of someone who had grown up aware of her family's complicated history. I knew my ancestor owned slaves, Elizabeth said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. My family has been dealing with that legacy for generations, but I didn't know about this. The photographs were always described as portraits of servants in their Sunday best. No one ever said wives. Emma showed her the research, the plantation records, the purchase receipts, the testimony from Samuel and Sarah, the evidence of the pattern spanning 15 years. Elizabeth's face went pale as she reviewed the documents. My God, he bought women like he was shopping for furniture. The term historians use is fancy trade, Emma said quietly. Enslaved women who were sold specifically for sexual purposes, often to wealthy white men who dressed them up and kept them as long-term mistresses. The practice was widespread but rarely documented this explicitly. Elizabeth looked at the photograph of Catherine for a long time. What was her full name? Did she have a family? I don't know her full name. The records only list her as Catherine. Enslaved people's surnames weren't typically recorded, and if she had family, they would have been split up when she was sold. Emma paused. But she was literate. She could read and write. Someone loved her enough to teach her, despite the risk. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and began typing notes. This needs to be told. My family's foundation has been working on reconciliation projects related to slavery. This would be an important addition to that work. There's something else, Emma said. She showed Elizabeth the records of the 5 women who had been forced into these false marriages with Jonathan Hartwell. Catherine was just one of many, and Jonathan Hartwell wasn't the only man who did this. I found similar photographs in collections across Charleston. This was a common practice, not an aberration. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. How many? I've identified over 30 photographs so far from the 1850s and 1860s alone, all showing wealthy white men posed with enslaved women dressed as wives, and those are just the ones that survived. There were probably hundreds more. Emma's research caught the attention of Dr. Angela Freeman, director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Dr. Freeman flew to Charleston to examine the photographs and documents personally. This is extraordinary work, Dr. Freeman said, studying the daguerreotype of Catherine under magnification. These images have been hiding in plain sight in archives and family collections for over a century, misidentified and misunderstood. You've given these women back their truth. She had brought with her a team of conservators and researchers. Together with Emma, they began a comprehensive survey of Charleston area collections. Looking for similar photographs, they found dozens. Each photograph told a similar story. Wealthy white men, young black women in expensive dresses, studio settings designed to mimic legitimate marriage portraits. Once they knew what to look for, the signs of coercion became obvious. The women's tense postures, the men's possessive grips, the absence of genuine joy in the compositions. One of Dr. Freeman's researchers, a genealogist named Michael Chen, began tracing the women in the photographs through plantation records and post-emancipation documents. It was painstaking work, but slowly, fragments of their lives emerged. He found records for a woman named Rose, who appeared in an 1858 photograph similar to Catherine. After emancipation, Rose had filed a claim with the Freedmen's Bureau, seeking compensation for 15 years of forced concubinage. Her claim was denied. The Bureau had no legal framework for addressing such cases, but her testimony survived. I was 15 when Mr. Davis bought me. He said I would live in the big house and have pretty dresses. I thought it meant I would be a lady's maid. The first night, I learned what he really wanted. I tried to resist, and he beat me. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would sell my mother to a plantation in Mississippi. So I stopped fighting. For 15 years, I wore silk dresses and smiled when white people looked at us, but at night, I prayed for death. Michael found another testimony from a woman named Hannah, documented by abolitionists in 1863 when she escaped to Union lines in Florida. Master bought me when I was 17 because I was pretty enough to show off, and he said. He made me pose for pictures with him, dressed me like a white woman, told people I was his wife. But I wasn't allowed to leave the plantation without him. I wasn't allowed to talk to other slaves without permission. If I displeased him, he would lock me in a room for days with no food. The other slaves hated me because I wore nice clothes and lived in the big house. They didn't understand I was as much a prisoner as they were, just in a prettier cage. These testimonies gave context to the photographs that plantation records never could. The images showed beautiful dresses and formal poses, but the women's own words revealed the violence, coercion, and trauma those images concealed. The National Museum of African American History and Culture announced a special exhibition, False Wives, Enslaved Women and the Photography of Possession. Emma's research formed the foundation, but it had grown to encompass over 60 photographs from collections across the South. The exhibition opened on a humid August evening in Washington, D.C. The gallery was packed with historians, descendants, journalists, and members of the public. Emma stood near the entrance, watching people file past the displays she had spent 6 months creating. The centerpiece was Catherine's photograph, enlarged and dramatically lit. But now it was surrounded by context. The plantation records documenting her purchase, Mary Simmons's diary entries describing her fear, Samuel's testimony about her attempted escapes, the death record reducing her to $1 value. A panel beside the photograph explained the practice of sexual slavery disguised as marriage, with historical context about laws prohibiting interracial marriage, the absolute power slave owners held over enslaved people, and the ways white supremacy justified horrific abuse. Most powerfully, the exhibition included the testimonies of the women themselves, Rose, Hannah, Sarah, and others, giving voice to experiences that had been silenced for over a century. Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison attended the opening, along with several other descendants of the men depicted in the photographs. She had written a public statement acknowledging her ancestors' crimes. Jonathan Hartwell used his wealth and power to exploit and abuse enslaved women for over 15 years. The photographs we preserved as innocent family history were actually evidence of systematic sexual violence. As his descendant, I cannot undo the harm he caused, but I can ensure these women's stories are finally told and their humanity recognized. Dr. Freeman gave the keynote address, standing before Catherine's photograph. For too long, we have sanitized the history of slavery, reducing it to economic exploitation while ignoring the sexual violence that was endemic to the system. These photographs force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Slavery was not just about labor. It was about total domination, economic, physical, and sexual. She gestured to the gallery of images. Each of these women was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister. They had dreams, fears, talents, and potential. They were forced into these false marriages, dressed up and photographed to legitimize their abuse. But look at their eyes. Look at their hands. Look at the tension in their bodies. They are telling us their truth if we are willing to see it. The exhibition became national news. Scholars began re-examining collections across the country, finding similar photographs that had been misidentified for generations. Descendants of enslaved women came forward with family stories that had been passed down quietly, painful memories of ancestors who had been forced into these situations. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Emma returned to Charleston. The Historical Society had created a permanent display based on her research, and they had commissioned something special. In Hampton Park, on the grounds where Riverside Plantation once stood, the city had erected a memorial. It was a simple bronze sculpture, a woman in an antebellum dress holding a book, her face lifted toward the sky. Her expression was dignified, resolute, defiant. The plaque read, "In memory of Catherine and all enslaved women forced into false marriages. Their silence was not consent. Their suffering was not love. Their story will not be forgotten." Below that, a longer inscription explained the history Emma had uncovered, naming Catherine and the other women whose photographs had been found, acknowledging the trauma they endured, and recognizing their humanity and resistance. Emma stood before the memorial as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Beside her stood Margaret Wright, a woman in her 70s, who had contacted Emma after the exhibition opened. "My great-great-grandmother was named Catherine," Margaret said quietly. "She was born enslaved in South Carolina, survived the war, and moved north during Reconstruction. She never talked about her time in bondage, but she kept one thing, a photograph of herself in a fancy dress. She showed it to my grandmother once and said, 'This is who they tried to make me be, but it wasn't who I was.'" Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Emma a photograph. It was Catherine, unmistakably the same woman from the daguerreotype, but taken years later. She wore simple clothes, stood with her arms crossed, and looked directly at the camera with an expression of hard-won strength. "She learned to read and write in slavery," Margaret continued. "After freedom, she taught other formerly enslaved people. She helped found a school for black children. She lived to be 73 and died surrounded by her family. He tried to break her, but he failed." Emma felt tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for sharing this, for showing me she survived, that she built a life after the horror," Margaret finished. Yes, the photograph you found shows what was done to her. This photograph shows who she really was. They stood together in silence, looking at the memorial. Other people began arriving, descendants, historians, community members. Some left flowers at the base of the sculpture. Others stood quietly, paying respects to women whose names many of them would never know. Emma thought about how the original photograph had appeared so tranquil at first glance. Just two people posed together. It had taken a closer look, at the man's grip on her shoulder, at the tension in her body, at the context hidden in archives, to see the truth. That's what history required. The willingness to look closer, to question comfortable narratives, to see what had been deliberately obscured. Catherine and the other women couldn't speak for themselves anymore, but their images remained, bearing witness. And now, finally, people were listening. Emma placed her hand on the memorial plaque, feeling the raised bronze letters beneath her fingers. "We see you now," she whispered. "We remember."